Good evening, good evening, good evening, and welcome to the virtual California African American Museum. For those of you that I have not yet had the pleasure of meeting either virtually or in person, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Alexandra Mitchell. I have the distinct honor and pleasure of serving as the Manager of Education and Public Programs at CAM. We're delighted that you've chosen to spend a part of your evening with us. You're in for a very special treat. Of course, we are joined this evening for the Netflix talkback of Blood Brothers, Malcolm X, and Muhammad Ali. This new documentary on Netflix, which premiered on September 9th, explores the three pivotal years that Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X forged a brotherhood that would not only change both men, but change the world. Blood Brothers, Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali tells the extraordinary story behind the friendship and ultimate falling out of two of the most iconic figures of the 20th century. Tonight's talkback features director and executive producer Marcus A. Clarke and senior arts editor at Variety, Jazz Tangcay. At Variety, Jazz covers all crafts below the line. She is also on the awards team analyzing the Emmys and Oscar races. Prior to joining Variety, Jazz worked at Awards Daily, where she covered film and TV and wrote reviews and analysis on the Emmys and Oscar races, respectively. She is also a member of the Gold Derby Experts. Marcus A. Clarke is a Brooklyn-born director and producer who directed Apple's feature-length documentary, The Wizard, following Atlanta rapper and superstar Future. In his earlier years, he worked as a film runner for Spike Lee's 40 Acres and the Mule Filmworks, and most recently, he directed 3 episodes of Netflix reboot of Unsolved Mysteries, produced by 21 Labs. In three of the 8 installments for Netflix's hip hop documentary Rapture, a 2018 South by Southwest selection produced by Mass Appeal. We hope that you enjoy this behind the scenes exclusive talkback on Blood Brothers. And again, if you have not already, please be sure to check out the documentary on Netflix. Without further ado, I'd like to turn the conversation over to Jazz and Marcus.
Thank you so much for that, Alexandra. Thank you to Netflix and thank you to the California African American Museum. I am so excited for this conversation with Marcus, who offers such a great perspective through interviews, never before seen footage, to chart this incredible friendship that may or may not have been known to many. So Marcus, welcome. Congratulations. I mean, you know, 2 of the most iconic figures in history, did you know about their story beforehand? Like how much did you know?
Yeah. Firstly, thank you for having me. And it's a pleasure to be here to talk about Blood Brothers today. I didn't actually know how deep the friendship was. I didn't know how deep the bond was between these 2 men. I definitely knew about their legacies separately, Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali, what their contributions have been, what their sacrifices have been, but I wasn't actually well-versed in this friendship. And so a big part of the process of making this documentary was discovering the friendship and finding this rare archival material that we could use that would really kind of give a good depiction, a good sense of what this admiration, what this friendship was really about. There's a lot of rare archival material in this film, rare photos and footage that a lot of people haven't really seen before. And, it was something that was extremely important to me and compelling because, like you said, these are 2 of the most iconic figures of the 20th century, and yet so little is known about this friendship that they had and what really happened between them,
Yeah. What's the story with the film? Like, how did it come your way, or how did you realize this is a story that has never been told that I need to tell?
Yeah, well, I can't take full credit for the timing of the film. Kenya Barris and Lightbox, Jonathan Chin Company here in Los Angeles, they optioned the book. They bought the rights to the book written by Randy Roberts and Johnny Smith. And they wanted to make this documentary and they were looking for a director. And, in the process, my agent, William Brown, connected me to Aaron Sampson, one of Kenya's executives. And, I came in kind of, I didn't know about the story. I didn't know that the friendship was there. And so immediately I was interested. And, I left that and did some preliminary research. into the friendship to see how real it really was, for myself. And one of the first things I ran into was a clip of Malcolm X referring to Cassius Clay as his brother. And another clip completely separate on a different date of Muhammad Ali referring to Malcolm X as his brother. And so this was kind of the first breadcrumbs that I found that really suggested, wait, this is something that was deep. These men really were connected in a bond in a way that was real. There isn't anybody else that they referred to publicly as brother, not that I could find. And so it was something that was really powerful and immediately let me know that there was a lot more under the surface here to kind of get to. And so I was extremely excited to get into it because, as a documentarian, finding new information and being able to present new information is really at the core of what we do in so many ways. And so I was kind of baffled that we hadn't really heard about this friendship in any significant depth before,
Yeah. I mean, and there is the book, there's photographs, but where does that research begin? Like, do you start with the book and then it's like, who's around that I can talk to? And we will talk about, having Muhammad Ali's brother in there later, which I can't wait to hear about that. But just as when you're putting a documentary together, where did that start?
Yeah. I mean, that was, to be honest with you, that was one of the really big challenges with the film, right? There's two factors, which is one, the story is 55, 56 years old, right? So it's a really long time ago. There's not a lot of people around still who witnessed it and could really speak to this relationship and really knew what this relationship was about. The other side of the coin is it was a very private relationship for a lot of reasons that you can glean in the film, but it was very private and very personal between these men. So again, there's not many people who can speak to that. And then one of the biggest challenges that I think sometimes people overlook when they think about Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali, unfortunately, when Malcolm X was assassinated at the age of 39 in 1965, he's on the outs with the Nation of Islam. He's losing friends faster than he's gaining them. There aren't a lot of people around him that he can still trust at that particular time. And so Muhammad Ali, in the contrast, he lives to 74 years old. He's an American hero and celebrated as an American hero. He has lots of friends and people who want to speak for him or about him. And so that presented a specific challenge. And like, how do you balance a story like this without having, all of those voices? So that was a real challenge, but that's how we kind of reached out to a lot of the family members. Like, as you mentioned, we got Rahman Ali in the film, which is like an incredibly precious interview for the film and really the closest man alive to the friendship. He was there every step of the way.
Yeah. And, the opening, I would love to know how you landed that opening. And like, it's the destiny that my father and Cassius Clay would meet, that, the short years that they would spend their lives. That quote is so powerful. And talk about getting to that opening of landing, which is, I mean, what is the end? It's like, that was their blood brotherhood, which solidifies where the story is going. So
yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. I'm glad that resonated with you. Openings in films are the most important part, right? In many ways for a filmmaker. And for me personally, when I'm doing documentaries, I'm always trying to infuse like narrative elements, things that you'd see in like a typical narrative film, and infuse some of those elements into the documentary space. Because in many ways, the truth is more cinematic and more dramatic than fiction. And so for this, it was like there were some stakes that needed to be established kind of right out of the gate. This is a destiny story. Malcolm X believed in destiny. Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali believed in destiny, and not in some trivial, lighthearted way. They really believed in destiny. And so, to open the film with Ilyasa Shabazz, daughter of Malcolm X, the blood of Malcolm X, literally, kind of professing, laying out what this relationship was, how brief of a time period it was, and really laying out which in my opinion is very much the thesis statement of the film, right? Which is Malcolm X came to this young man and he gave him the power that he needed to speak. And so it was a very clear and succinct thesis statement that I shared as well. And I feel like laid out a lot of the stakes of what you're going to see. You know, again, this is a short 3-year time period of a relationship between 1962 and 65. And so I wanted that information kind of right up front out of the gate. That leads us right into the title sequence, which is really big, a lot of horns, great music, almost feels like a superhero's entrance, like intro music, you know? And for me, Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X are superheroes to me, you know what I mean? And so I wanted to give it that gravity. I wanted to give it that weight. And then creatively with the title sequence, it's like, you know, we're looking at these moments in history that are preserved, right? They're preserved in glass, like almost like a slide when you go to the library, like under microfilm. But those slides are damaged a little bit. They're cracked, right? And I felt like that was a poetic kind of metaphor to set up the stakes of looking at these men's legacies in more depth. And then also, you know, there's a difference between like a shatter of glass and like what happens when pressure, if you have pressure on both sides. And so the intro sequence is a poetic way of kind of leading up the themes that you're going to see kind of later in the film. And then another part of the intro is right after the title sequence. You know, we open the film with this beautiful, dazzling smile from Malcolm X. And it's in this beautiful archival photo of him with Cassius Clay. And, you know, to me, some of these moments look like the happiest moments in their life, you know? And so it was important for me to bring kind of a different perspective, a more compassionate, human perspective to the story.
Yeah. And, you know, you talk about, you know, adding weight to the story. The other thing that you do, you're not just covering their friendship, you're also talking about the political climate, the cultural climate of what is going on around them at the time. How did you weave this puzzle together of your interviews, you know, the historians, their story, the family members, and putting in this story? Like, talk about that challenge.
Yeah.
Of telling it's such a succinct story too, which is incredible.
Thank you. It's that was definitely a challenge, again, because, you know, as I mentioned, the relationship was private. Not a lot of people know the story, and to be honest with you, there isn't one single person who knows the complete story of these men's friendship and what happened. And so all of the guests in the film, you know, carry a certain part of the story. They intimately understand the parts of the story that they're speaking to. And so it was really important for me to have that balance and that chemistry, and to almost feel like when you're watching the film, that one interviewee is kind of passing the torch of the story to the next person and to the next person, and carrying it to the next pivotal moment. And so in that way, kind of with that creative science, so to speak, the film kind of naturally formed a structure of who could speak to what and what's appropriate for people to speak to. You know, a lot of people, when they think about experts talking on a subject, they just think of the scholars, the historians. And for me, the family is equally experts, right? They are also experts. They're experts in the legacy. They're experts in the motivation of these men and what they were about and what they stood for. And I think their insight is extremely valuable in trying to understand what could or couldn't have been going through these guys' minds at the time. You know, they really speak for their parents in a way that is incredibly powerful, that only, you know, there are certain things they can say that only they can say that'll resonate. And so, you know, the structure of the film, I got to give credit to my editor, Jeremy Seifer. You know, the process of making that storyline and that story arc is really between the director and the editor, and the producers as well, but really the director and the editor. And so he really helped me to thread that needle. I knew which parts of the story I wanted people to speak about. A lot of those sources are parts of the book or are parts of the research from Johnny Smith and Randy Roberts. And so Peter Goldman and Robert Lipsyte and Jerry Eisenberg and, you know, A. Peter Bailey, you know, these people they've spent a lot of their lives either writing about Muhammad Ali or Malcolm X. And so they're the best kind of sources of some of this material. And people like Herb Boyd, you know, he met Malcolm X. He had personal interactions with him. And so, you know, we tried to get as close to the source as possible.
Yeah. And here we are, you know, in 2021, and, you know, just now it seems like this is coming to light, this incredible friendship. You know, why has it taken so long to have this story highlighted that, earlier this year, we had, Regina King's One Night in Miami with a little, also touching on that. But yeah, why has it taken almost 50 years? My maths is terrible, so.
No, yeah, it's fine. I think that's a really good question. It's something I asked myself a lot kind of throughout this process, is like, well, why don't we know this? And I don't think there's a solid answer 100%, but I will say, Malcolm X's persona and his image has been, I think, intimidating for a lot of people in America for a while. I think he's been divisive in some ways to some people, and that level of intimidation, I think, about the message that he had and the things he was saying, has caused him to not exactly get the fair due and recognition of history that he probably deserved, that he does deserve. Certainly not as much as Martin Luther King. And so I think that in the process of that, he was also, affiliated with the Nation of Islam. And, at that time, in the 60s, the Nation of Islam was seen by the media, as a hate organization. And so, there's probably plenty of reasons why his contributions and his impact have been downplayed, particularly around his relationship with Muhammad Ali, which I think is incredibly ironic. And when you see the film and you see the impact that the mentor Malcolm X had on Muhammad Ali, it's hard to divorce how that impact couldn't have played out later on in Muhammad Ali's life as he goes around the world, as a humanitarian, speaking out for civil rights, for justice, for equality, for love of Black and brown people. And so in many ways, he kind of took the mantle that Malcolm had in his own way and continued the message. And so similarly to the thesis of the film, he gave him the power he needed to speak. And, I think that shouldn't be forgotten.
Yeah. And a powerful, so many of the, interviews are powerful, but, Rahman Ali talking about, destiny can take your best friend, like that, his words, talk about sitting down with him and what that was like to just hear that blood connection talk about this icon in history.
Yeah, the Rahman Ali interview is it's one of the most special interviews in the film. It's the most precious interview in the film, in my opinion, because it gets us that much closer to the relationship. Rahman was there with Muhammad Ali, Cassius Clay, all through his life. In many ways, his support system, his foundation. He was his sparring partner. They went through life together. And when you watch the film, Rahman Ali is in the background every step of the way. He's right next to Cassius Clay. He's in between Cassius Clay and Malcolm X at the United Nations. And so he's really the closest and the best firsthand account we can have of the reality of this relationship, of the truth of this relationship. And I think, once I got that interview, I left that interview knowing exactly how I was going to tell the story, right? Which is like, almost like your grandfather, sitting back in a rocking chair, like, come a little closer, I'm going to tell you a story. You know what I mean? Like, we're going to go down the rabbit hole. And what's incredibly, like, what people should take away from that is that Rahman displays a full range of emotions when it comes to speaking about this. And because he's a man of a certain age and he's had several strokes, he's very particular with the words that he uses to describe this relationship. And the admiration he has for Malcolm and the admiration he has for Malcolm's influence on his brother. And so you see this kind of contrast, because later on in the film, when you get to these issues of the betrayal, he's also still very angry and he's still holding on to a lot of frustration. And he voices that in the film. And, I think that is a very, it underscores just how complicated the relationship was, how complex it was, that there was both admiration and these other kind of feelings of betrayal. And that's a really human story, and I think it just points out how complex this was. By the end of the film, he's emotional. He's really kind of struggling with all of these different emotions and feelings. And, just as far as one other thing I want to say, just as far as like how brotherhood goes and, how people make decisions, I think it's very telling that as close as Rahman is with his brother, when you get to the end of the film, Muhammad Ali hadn't directly spoken about feeling bad. He's like, I know my brother, he felt bad. Yeah, it hurt him bad, yes. But who did he tell? He told his daughter. He told Hana Ali how he felt. And so that's an interesting decision, right? That even in later in age, he didn't share that with his brother, but he chose to share it with his daughter. And I think that's very revealing about his character and who he was. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's just interesting. And I don't think that's something that people are really aware of.
Yeah. And something that, was so striking was just how much you managed to tell in 90 minutes. So talk about how you crafted the story curve in that time. And did it change at all based on the interviews of mapping, was there an interview that changed the direction of how the story ended up? I love hearing that from documentary filmmakers.
Yeah, of course. When I approach a film, in terms of my personal process, I will have a concept, an idea for how to approach the storytelling, what elements I think are most important, what emotions I think I'm going to try to tap into. But that concept is always something that's fluid, because when you're doing documentaries, you always have to leave open that you don't know the story, right? And that through these interviews with experts and all these different people, you're going to learn new pieces of information, and those pieces of information are what you have to follow to get to the core story, So for me, we started and I'm like, well, I know that Muhammad Ali said that his greatest regret was turning his back on Malcolm X. So there's a regret element that we're going to use to kind of get into this. He's already stated it. And for the greatest to state that his greatest regret was turning his back on Malcolm X says almost everything you need to know. The other part was, Malcolm X was 17 years older than Cassius Clay Muhammad Ali. And so I saw immediately that there was going to be a unique way of doing kind of parallel storytelling, right? Where in the first 20 minutes, you get a little bit of Malcolm X's early story, a little bit of Cassius Clay's early story. You're watching a film in which they're going to meet. And so there's an anticipation of this kind of their paths coming together and colliding. And so I knew I wanted to do that. How it was going to play out, I did not know. And then to answer your question about, changes in the film, after getting the Rahman interview, I really knew kind of the exact way in which we were going to do the storytelling. Rahman was going to be the emotional anchor of the film, the emotional through line and thread that would connect all the dots and give credibility to the moments that we're talking about. And we can keep checking in with Rahman. But, not until I got the interview with Ilyasa Shabazz, which just as fate would have it was the final interview. Not until I got that interview did I really understand the full scope of the story. And to be honest with you, I needed all of the interviews that came before her interview to be prepared enough and ready enough to kind of unlock the third chapter of the film. Had that interview happened at any time earlier, the film would not be what it is today. And so once I got that interview with her, it was it unlocked, like magic, this third chapter, which is Muhammad Ali reaching out to the daughters of Malcolm X and forming this relationship and this bond that seems to grow out of the regret and the remorse that he felt. And as Ilyasa mentions in the film, it's likely that he felt he owed it to Malcolm to play a role in their life and to be there for them and to make sure they were okay and that they were safe. That's an incredibly symbolic gesture. And I think it really shows just how deep the emotions Muhammad Ali had towards Malcolm X, that all these years later, he still was trying to make right, or he came to a moment in his life when he was trying to make it right.
Yeah. And I know you have these great voices, the blood family voices too. Whose interview touched you the most and changed you, I guess, for the better? I mean, it's such an inspiring story too. Mm-hmm. Which one had that personal impact?
I think we just talked about the Rahman interview, but yeah, I mean, the Rahman interview was incredibly powerful for everybody who was there, for everybody who was in the room. Because he looks like Muhammad Ali, he embodies his energy in such a strong way. And you can almost feel Ali's presence when you're around him. There's something really honest and sincere about how he conducts himself. and the things he says, like even though I might not agree with the things he says, it's so honest and it's so pure, and it's so human that it helps you understand the kind of the sentiment and the energy at that time. And it was just very, very precious. And part of that is, again, because he's had so many strokes. And so the interview was challenging, to say the least. It's probably about a 3 hour long interview. And part of that is having to, retalk questions and remind him of what we're talking about and go back to it. Believe it or not, he's very sharp. He just has some impediments. And so, before we got that interview from outside sources, I was told, he's too old, he doesn't remember anything, don't waste your time. But I needed to see it for myself. Here's a living member who was there, and he's in every picture I look at between these two men. I needed to see it for myself. And I'm really happy that we did and grateful that we did, because I think that made all the difference. And then the Ilyasah Shabazz interview was also pivotal, because again, it opened up new information for us. It's incredibly personal and private. And, throughout the interview, she's tapping into something, right? Like, yes, I'm interviewing her, but she was tapping into something really deep. And the words that were coming out of her mouth were like poetry, poetry to the story, poetry to her father, poetry to the relationship. It was hard to ignore. And so that opening kind of quote from her kind of came very naturally and very powerful. I think she was also being very careful with her words to say what she thought was right and what her father would think is right. And that kind of energy, I think, comes across on the screen.
Yeah. And you talk about, their friendship, and, such a great part of the story is looking at, I guess, how they separated, and I guess the disintegration of that. Like, talk about putting that story, that part of the story together, and just learning about
it's
what kind of tore them apart, I guess is the phrase.
Right. It's very challenging, right? Because this isn't an easy story. As Miriam says, this is not a simple storyline. And there are all these different factors at work, right? And so for me, it was really important to show the different levels at which, the stakes were. There were a lot of stakes involved here. And this was a really kind of compromising and challenging position for both men to be in, particularly Muhammad Ali, who's in his early 20s. I don't know what you were doing in your early 20s, but I would not have been able to manage this kind of a power dynamic, and all these heavy themes. Like that's a lot to put on someone in their early 20s. And so we tried to kind of show the different dynamics and really the sentiment of that time, and the people of that organization at that time. Because I think for a lot of Black and brown people, we look at the assassination of Malcolm X and we're like, how could that happen, right? Why did that happen? What could he have possibly done to deserve something like that? And I don't think we necessarily have answers for that, but it was important for me to try to show and understand the sentiment and the energy in which people were holding on to, this vitriolic energy. As you can see, it hasn't really gone away. Rahman displays it. Melchizedek Supreme Shabazz Allah displays it, and it's shocking. I think it's going to be shocking to most people. It was shocking to me, but it really kind of shows again the sentiment and the energy of people at that time and how they were viewing it. And so again, it's important as we're doing a documentary like this to show all these different factors and these different layers, to try to get a better understanding of what was going on and why this decision and this moment was so hard for both of these men. And that truth is really hard to digest. I think a lot of people veer away from it because it's so challenging and it can change people's opinions of things. But I think it's important that we can look at some people might say mistakes or transgressions about our heroes, and still celebrate our heroes. I don't think this takes away from their legacy. I think it adds to their humanity and gives people a greater understanding of that.
Talk about putting this together in the pandemic. It's challenging enough to tell a story.
Yeah.
You've done all your interviews before, we went into lockdown, but then you're editing and putting those touches together. Like, talk about that challenge?
Yeah, that was definitely a challenge. The entire editing process for this film happened during lockdown. So a year and a half of being isolated through the pandemic, George Floyd protests going on outside, protests in all 50 states, insurrections at the Capitol building, like America's on fire outside. And we're sitting here trying to edit this film and trying to come up with new ways to edit the film. Because in the past, we'd all be in the same room. We'd be having conversations, complex conversations about like how to depict something and where to cut out of an interview, where to cut into an interview. Like, so much time is spent face to face. So we had to do all of that virtually, come up with ways to simultaneously kind of review and edit people in different locations. It was really challenging mentally, also just staying focused on the mission with what's going on outside. And then also, trying to make sure that the film has messages in it also that are going to resonate, right? Resonate with the times. And fortunately, we didn't have to do too much to address that because, unfortunately, the same situations that we're dealing with today, Malcolm X was trying to address in the 60s. And so as much as things have changed and there's been tons of progress, there's still a long way to go. And I didn't even have to necessarily point my finger and say, oh, look, things are the same, because you can inherently see that. And so that was definitely a challenge in terms of, keeping discipline to the story and making sure we're laser focused on telling the story of the friendship. There was definitely a temptation to kind of, use Malcolm X's speeches to address everything that was happening in the country, which could have been a route, but that would definitely distract from the core story, right? And the intimacy of the relationship that I'm trying to show. And so we made some really kind of calculated decisions around what portions of speeches to use and which segments would really resonate with what's happening today. But it was definitely one of the hardest projects, one of the most challenging projects I've taken on, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Talk about working with Kenya Barris and what that conversation was like, and just having that incredible voice alongside you.
Yeah. Kenya's incredible. This project, is something that I think is really near and dear to both of us, something we're both incredibly passionate about. His father was actually a member of the nation at one point in time. And so we both understood the gravity of what needed to be done here. And so, the chemistry was really positive and really good. And it was really, Kenya really challenged me to dig deep and to really push me to go deep into myself, into my culture, into my heritage, into finding a creative way to kind of personalize the film without distracting from the actual story. And so, that's, my parents are Jamaican. I'm of Jamaican descent, and they named me after Marcus Garvey. And so tapping into some of that was kind of how we got to some of these elements in the film, amplifying the message of Marcus Garvey and his relationship to Malcolm X's parents and his influence on them, and really connecting that message to what Malcolm is trying to do kind of in the final chapter of his life, which is, awaken Black and brown people and connect us in Africa, in the Caribbean, in the United States, to understand that, we have similar struggles. We're in the same struggle. And that there needs to be unity. There needs to be a communication between Black and brown people in the world. And so, that comes out of the Pan-African movement. That comes out of literally the philosophy of Marcus Garvey. And so, Kenya helped me get to that place. And so, as you start to put your layers on it, he helped me get there. Then I put another layer on it. Next thing you know, Redemption Song is in the film. And it's, this poetic way to point to the redemption that both men sought through their travels through Africa and to Mecca, and the redemption part of the story, which is both men went through this redemption period, this phase. And so to connect the breadcrumbs of history and to make it personal and make it so that it's like, there's a piece of me in there, something I'm incredibly grateful to Kenya for. And he hired me for this job. He put me in this position. So, I felt a deep sense of responsibility to not just do right for him, and because this is the first documentary out of his deal, but because there's a responsibility with the legacy of these men also. And I didn't want to ruin that. I wanted to uphold that and do something that was significant, that I think a lot of people can watch and learn a lot from. that would really resonate with people and last the test of time.
Yeah. And, you know, I studied history in the UK, American history, so it was great getting that perspective. But what I loved that you did here, and if people haven't seen this documentary, please go out and see it. You know, America is reframes, I think is what they're reframing their legacy, whether it's Malcolm X's and Muhammad Ali's, Cassius Clay's. What you did so expertly was you open with a smile, which we've talked about. You give Malcolm X compassion and humanity. You do not portray him as an angry man, which we've seen so many times. Mm-hmm. How did you get to the heart of this? How did you get to his heart to get that across?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was something that was really important to me in terms of showing this different perspective of him. And I think that, you know, one of the things I do always in the beginning of a documentary is I look at all the other material, right? Everything else that exists about these men, I've consumed, I've watched, I've read in some form or another. And I always will look at those things as kind of the what not to do, right? And so I'm trying to avoid some of the typical, I don't want to say pitfalls, but the typical decisions that you might see. You know, in this film, you're not going to see by any means necessary. You're not going to hear about the Ballad of the Bullet. Most people have heard that already, right? And so for me, it was important to kind of move aside some of the things that we've seen before and get closer to what these men were about and what motivated them. And so, you know, it's not just the smile, but it's like seeing Malcolm as a kid, hearing about what happened to him, what was he seeing around him as a child. And similarly, the same thing for Cassius Clay. You know, these moments in our childhood, our upbringing are incredibly powerful and decisive to the people who we end up becoming. It shapes the way we see the world. And so, you know, I wanted to avoid those ideas of intimidation, of him being intimidating and fiery and angry, as you said. You know, people are more complex than that. You know, people have a side of them that's compassionate. They might have a side of them that's fiery. You know, there's this balance going on. And so for me, I'm like, well, why haven't we seen Malcolm X smile that often? Why haven't we seen these moments why can't we do a film about Black men being friends? You know what I mean? Like these are very simple questions that we don't usually get. And so, you know, it was kind of, it was right there in front of me to do. It just needed to be recognized to treat it that way. So myself and my team, you know, really tried to put a lot of love and compassion into the film and into our approach. And we hope that really comes across with everything. But that was, you know, we wanted to be able to show a different side of these men than you usually see and avoid the temptation to make them caricatures.
Yeah. And the animation sequence, I always love when you have that in documentaries. It's always fascinating. Mm-hmm. Like, what was the idea to have that?
Yeah,
in Blood Brothers.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I love the animations. You know, we made the decision to go graphic novel animation, which is black and white, right? So right off the bat, it's underscoring kind of the themes that we're talking about in the film on a very kind of basic level. But on a deeper level, there are these two moments: the first meeting between Malcolm X and Cassius Clay, and this other story, the Bruce Hill story in 1963, where there are incredible moments that underscore what's happening in the story. But there's no archival material that exists. There's no photo of this moment. There's no video of this moment. But for a film like this is the moment when they meet. This is the moment when things change. And so it was really important to be able to depict that scene while not taking too much creative liberty around the scene, right? So with graphic novel animation and going black and white, what you end up getting is a sense of the action and what's happening, stripped of all the detail, right? And so it still leaves space for your imagination to work. It still leaves space for you to think about, well, what was this like? And what did the room look like? And, you know, it's giving just enough information for you to see and envision what happened without taking too much creative license, without being like, well, what about the depiction of Malcolm? Or he didn't sound enough like Malcolm. And he didn't sound like Ali. It takes away all of that. But you can still understand the very basic of what is the action. Here comes Cassius Clay, he's coming into a diner, Malcolm X is in the diner, they shake hands, they meet, this is a moment. And so, you know, it was something that I thought was creative, that's entertaining. And also with so much archival material, when you do graphic novel animation, the black and white, it kind of just falls back into the film. It like sinks into the picture, right? It doesn't call too much attention to itself. And so all these kind of creative decisions were to make it feel seamless and also to be able to show these scenes and these moments without overstepping our bounds in terms of the creative license.
Love that. What are you hoping the audiences take away from watching the movie?
You know, there's so many messages in this film that I hope resonate with people and that people can identify. But I think one of the biggest ones is, you know, I think Black and brown people and people in general, you know, we are often too easily divided. We're too easily pit against each other. And I think when you watch this film, you definitely see that. And to be clear, they weren't easily split. You know, they're actually trying to hold on to their friendship at the end. They're trying to hold on still and not kind of completely separate, but then they're forced to. But I think when you look at the film, you have to ask yourself, you know, the question comes up like, well, what if Malcolm X wasn't assassinated at 39 years old, right? How would history be different? How would the Black Lives Matter movement be different? Because Malcolm was literally trying to address these exact issues around police brutality, around the killing of unarmed Black men. He wanted to have a coordinated, disciplined response anytime something like this happened. You know what I mean? Like almost like a response team, like the Avengers coming to hold us down. And so 55, 56 years later, we're still dealing with those exact same issues with no response. Well, excuse me, with a response, but not exactly in the form or the level of effectiveness that I think Malcolm was looking for. We're still dealing with those same issues. And so if this relationship could be this powerful and it's only 3 years long, what would have happened if the relationship was 10 years long? What if Malcolm X wasn't assassinated at 39? Like so many things could be different. The influence that Malcolm had on Cassius Clay and Muhammad Ali, when you see it, you have to then look at the rest of Muhammad Ali's life and career and consider how much Malcolm, you know, put the battery in his back. That level of love and support and tutelage between men and women, but in this case between men, you know, is incredibly valuable for people to be able to tap into their potential, right? So much of what the Nation of Islam was teaching them at the time was you are divine. And if you actually knew your history, you'd know that you are destined and you are able to do great things. And that message was incredibly powerful and compelling to these men because it's the opposite of what white America tells us, right? It's not that we're inferior or we're 2/3 of a man or less than. You know, they're telling them the opposite. And this allowed them to free their minds. And that's something that's incredibly powerful message that, you know, if that message were disseminated to all of Black and brown people, can you imagine the progress we'd be able to achieve?
Amazing. Marcus, thank you so much for that incredible conversation and insight into your work, and congratulations on Blood Brothers, which is now streaming on Netflix.
Incredible. Yeah, such a well-researched, deeply thought out, and rigorously engaged film project. So excited. If you have not checked it out, I'm sure this conversation, it was going to be a driving factor into you viewing it with yourself and your family. Thank you to Jazz for your dynamic moderation. As always, we appreciate it. And again, congratulations to Marcus. And if you have not already seen it, check it out on Netflix. With that, we'll close out the conversation for tonight. Be safe, and we hope to see you very soon. Everybody have a great night. Bye-bye.
Thank you.